Here we are again reviewing CzechRaizor's big $5 win. If you enjoy this type of content, definitely check out my poker training site, floattheturn.com. There I frequently review my hands and other players' hands. And we also have a few other coaches who play online multi-table tournaments on a very regular basis. They are online professional multi-table tournament players. So if you're into that, check out floattheturn.com. And let's go ahead and continue moving forward.
Another larger point I played should be with King Queen 40 big blinds deep, or with a stack of 40 big blinds, just over 40 big blinds, in early position 8-handed. Opening just over min is reasonable at this time because the stacks are not deep at all, so I should not be 3xing or 2.5xing anymore, and just making it a little bit more than 2x. And the reason is that once I make it 2x, I think the players are just inclined to call too much from big blind, and I do not want to give such good odds. So this is the reason for me opening just over 2x. I get flatted, I get called in position from Cash Tony, his passive player, and big blind as well. So we are 3-way to the flop, which is very, very interesting.
This is a fun flop because there are a lot of draws that can easily call a bet. So typically you want to be betting on the larger side on boards this draw heavy, especially with these stacks, because you don't want to bet something like 1,000 and let someone easily call. So I think you usually want to be betting something like 2,700 here. That's going to set up a nice size pot where you could conceivably jam the turn versus Cash Tony, and obviously get it in versus this player. You don't really want to bet smaller, I don't think, because if you bet like 2,000, Cash Tony can call, and then you have this weird stack to pot ratio going to the turn. But well, let's see what you do.
Very joy. And I should start value betting, because there are very many combinations of hands that I can get value from. 10x, 8x, so many gotchas, so many hands like Jack 10, 10-9, King 10, King Jack, Flush draw, just so many draws. So for this reason I would like myself betting on the large side, around 60% but and only folding on like these. If Cash Tony decides to call and 9 of spades falls off on the turn, that's probably the only card that I can get away from this spot on turn. Otherwise I would be looking for getting the stacks in on by the turn with either of these players. Okay, so let's see if I decide to c-bet with large sizing 2.3k. I like the fact that I decided to go over half pot, but I could have gone 2.6, 2.7. I wonder if this is a mistake. Okay.
I think it's worth mentioning that the only reason this, I think, is a worse bet than 2.7k, 2,700, is that it sets up this weird stack to pot ratio versus Cash Tony if he calls. We're not really concerned with this player here, because if he has something, he's going to put his money in. If he doesn't, he's going to fold. Whereas I think Cash Tony, you want to go ahead and price out the draws the best you can, and also build the pot so that you can get it in on safe turns. If you make this size bet and he calls, pot's going to be about 8,000 going to the turn, and he's going to have about 10,000 behind. So it'd be a slightly over pot shove then, whereas if you bet 2,700, it would be closer to a pot size shove.
Like 2 folds, which is quite surprising, quite shocking, given 2 ranges on this flop. I would never ever bluff or c-bet this flop without any equity into 2 players.
Yeah, that's a good idea. You want to have something with equity there.
Pocket sixes or ace-5 of hearts, I would never c-bet here in this situation on this flop. So on to another big hand, or rather large pot that I played. Blinds I have 350, 700, so I got 30, 4, 5, 6 big blinds and ace king. Decided to go for the same, just over 2x open from EP, and let's see what happens. I got flatted, I got called from big blind. Guy with Reggie stats, 20, 21, 19, 6, so I presume this guy's a reg. Again, very interesting spot. I could c-bet on the small side, I think the c-betting on small, I'm thinking out loud that c-betting on the small side is good because I'm often, I'm ahead too often. So this bet works as a value bet slash protection slash folding his equity share, which means basically protection. So if he folds hands like 9-10 of spades or Jack-10 of diamonds or just any random high cards, it is not a bad result for me because I just take down the board right here. But I could also see a reason for checking back and checking behind, not do value card myself, because once I bet, I only get called by. Whereas I guess he could call ace jack once, but not entirely sure about this. So yeah, interesting spot, and wonder what's the best approach.
I typically bet small in this spot with almost my entire range. This is a board that should not hit your opponent very often at all. So I definitely like a small bet of maybe 1,400 in this spot, maybe even smaller, like 1,200. And like you said, it is primarily for protection slash value because you can get called by some worse stuff whenever you bet that small.
It's okay, so I decided to check back. And turns a 10 of hearts, opening backdoor heart draw, and some straight draws. 10x could be in his range, like Jack 10 suited, Queen 10 suited, King 10 suited maybe, 10-9. So there are some 10x's. I decided to check back again.
So whenever you check through the flop, on the turn, should we check behind again? I think this becomes a little bit closer. I would not be shocked if betting the turn is still fine. If you do bet, I, again, think you should probably bet on the smaller side because we are trying to get called by some garbage. But once you check behind on the flop, I think you probably need to just be inclined to get to showdown and be happy enough with that.
This is one of the spots where I'm not quite sure what to do. Obviously, once I bet, I get body from weaker hands that are primarily draws, like Jack 9 and a hard draw, although I'm blocking some hard draws with King. And yeah, so basically I just get paid by straight draws and some flush draws. But once I get called, I wonder if I should continue bluffing on the river and trying to fold. Like, I do not imagine there's too many hands that he's going to fold on the river once I bet the river, especially when the river is a blind like a 3 or 5 or 4 or 6. I do not see him folding 10x like ever. If he's got 6-7, I'm not sure that he calls that on the turn. So there's no point for me to continue bluffing on blind rivers.
So I don't really view it as your turn bet being a bluff because you're not really making any better hands fold, right? So for that reason, I don't think you want to value bet again on the river. And I don't really see too many hands that will call the turn that beat you that will fold on the river besides exactly the small pairs. I mean, maybe a hand like 7-6 will call the turn bet, but that's about it. So I think if you bet the turn, it is for value protection. Then when you get to the river, I don't think there's any point in trying to bluff because I don't think a whole lot of those hands are going to be folding. And obviously all the worst hands are going to be folding. So I would just check behind and realize your equity. You could maybe make some big bet on the river. Let's think about this. Imagine on the river, well, let's say you bet small on the turn, like 1,200 or 1,500 and your opponent calls. Pot's 7,500 on the river. You could go all in. At that point, it'd be nearly impossible for your opponent to have a queen, given the way the hand has played out. So maybe you could jam the river. That might be the bet that gets a fold very near 100% of the time, especially against someone who's playing 21-19, 6-3 bet. Not a crazy player at all. So maybe that's the best play. Maybe the best play is to bet something like 1,500 on the turn. That's going to keep the range wide. And then on a blank river, you don't want to be shoving on a king, jack. Well, maybe a jack is still okay. King, jack. I think you should just be shoving when you're bluffing, but you don't want to be bluffing on the obviously bad rivers. So I think the jack 9 and the king jack are obvious hands your opponent could have. So you want to bet ace. You don't want to bet huge, at least on ace, king, and 9, and maybe 8. The other rivers I think would be pretty sweet to shove on. I think you're going to win the pot almost every time in that scenario. So you go from losing whenever your opponent happens to have pocket 7s or 7-6 and check calls your turn bet. You win all of those pots on top of all the times that you would have had the best hand anyway. And I don't think very many people are making a huge hero call here. They're just going to think you have a queen and you're making some silly play.
So betting here would be just for the clear purpose or for the sole purpose of party betting. And I just gotta decide. I do not know what is the best option, whether to bet or check behind. I decided to check behind. Nice river. Which gives me a nut straight. Only the full houses are possible, so I do not have nuts, but the highest possible straight. I rivered nut straight, and I decided to go for just over half pot size. Targeting Jack X, probably. Yeah. This is the clear value target in this hand is Jack X, maybe 10x, and maybe and like 8-9. If he had 8-9 and got a low straight by the river, I think that it's could be part of his range. So I'm targeting like Jack X and 8-9 and maybe and it's like 10x, King 10. So again, would like to know what do you think about this sizing.
So I think in this spot, I would have been inclined to bet a little bit smaller. I think when you bet 2,400, you're going to get your opponent to fold out a 10 and worse hands pretty much every time. Whereas I think if you bet something like 1,800, maybe your opponent does start calling off a little bit more often. So yeah, interesting spot. I think I would have bet a little bit smaller here for that reason. I think if you bet just a little bit smaller, you'll start inducing more folds. So that's generally what I would do in this scenario. Opponent does call, though. Maybe he has a 10. Do we not get to see? Guess we don't get to see.
So we are at 1k, big blind.
Bad beat.
And just 24, 25 bigs deep. And getting dealt a premium hand. In a big blind. Facing 3x. Again, now this is a weaker player, or very, very active and play happy player. So I can see myself going for a larger size of 3-bet, just 3-betting, getting a nice PSR, pot stack ratio, post flop, so there is less than pot size bet left on the flop. One thing that I have in mind when deciding whether to 3-bet or shove is that the recreational player, or players in general, they really like to see flops, even though they do not realize they do not have a good odds pre-flop. So they could easily call half of their stack just to see the flop with pocket ace 9s or queen jack, king jack, ace jack, ace 10. So for this reason, I think 3-betting is clearly better of the options.
This goes back to, playing against weaker players compared to playing against stronger players. Against stronger players, I virtually never 3-bet here just because it looks so incredibly strong. But you have 16 hands on this guy, which is not very many, but he's playing a lot of them. So again, this guy should be super wide. And I don't really know if you have stats on... Let's take a look at your heads-up display. Are there stats on here that let us know how aggressive he is after the flop? I would say generally no, right? Besides flop c-bet. I think you want either some sort of like total aggression frequency, or you want just more stats in general. Because I would like to know if this guy... I can't talk. I would like to know if this type of player is going to be trying to bluff me off of all sorts of stuff if I call. Like if this guy is going to be triple barreling me a lot, because we know he has a very high flop turn river c-bet, for example, then I would be very inclined to call. But given we don't know that, because we only have 16 hands, or if we just had a heads-up display that did not have those numbers on it for some reason, I would probably just 3-bet, as you said. And I think I would probably make it something like 8,000 in this spot. That's going to give us a pot size shove on the turn. Maybe 9,000 is a little bit better, so we're betting a little bit less than pot. Always think ahead about what size we'll be betting going to the turn.
I'll make it just under 3x. So the pot would be around 20k, and then leaving us 17k behind in the stacks. So about 8.9, 8.85 stack ratio behind, which I like. I get shoved on. So this, I just hope I call it off. I don't fold.
Yeah, don't fold.
And yes. So it is with this particular hand, of this specific hand of him having pocket jacks, the result is the same. If I shoved, I do not think he would manage to fold, or he would get away from this. So it is the same result, but just for the chance of him having weak part of his range like king jack and queen jack and ace 10, ace x and pocket ace 9s, I think there's a very good there's a decent chance that he decides to just take what he believes is a safer route and see a flop, and then I could manipulate the rest of the stack on the flop, which is very easy when having less than both sides left on the flop. Okay.
Yep, I agree with all that. Discussing shoving preflop, I think shoving preflop's okay if you think the guy's going to call a lot, but with that guy's such loose stats, I don't think you want to do that play against him. If he was a very tight player raising under the gun, then I would definitely shove, but not against a loose player. All right, so here, unknown guy raises under the gun again. I'm probably just defending this. I don't know if we want to be getting it in. I mean, getting it in is obviously fine, but 3-betting's okay. Either play is fine in this scenario. I don't think it really matters so much.
And pocket jacks on the button. I remember this hand being in this spot pre-flop, and thinking that this guy is really tight, really nitty, and he opened hand. It looks very, very scared play, and it looks very nitty on my side, on my path. But I felt at this point that I didn't want to 3-bet get it in, which to some higher stakes player this may seem very strange or maybe even grotesque. But I felt at this point that I could just flat and see what happens post, and like semi-set mine, semi-slash, see what he does on various flops or turns, and possibly get away from my hand on the turn. So it looks super tight, but this is the reason behind my play here. There's not much folding I'm going to do since from this point when hitting top set, but the plan was there, and let's see what happens. Facing this bet, I'm thinking whether putting in a raise accomplishes more than calling. Obviously, if he's the top of his range, like Queen's Plus, it would be the best to raise here, and I should not expect him to fold at all, pretty much ever, because he should not be able to put me on pocket jacks, and I don't think he thinks that I flat pocket threes, maybe pocket fives, but it's quite out of my range as well. So he should feel really, really safe about his hand on this flop if he had Queens Plus. But there's obviously a decent chance that he's got ace king. There's many combos of those. 16 for 12 plus 4. So this is again a situation where I do not know what's the best line. As long as I do not fold, I think both are reasonable, but I'm not sure. So let's see what I did. I decided to flat. Yeah.
I definitely think calling's better than raising. Notice here, if you call, the pot's going to be this size, quite huge, right? So if your opponent ever puts money in the pot on the turn and the river, either by betting and or check calling, you are going to be able to stack him. So this is a spot where your opponent's range should be pretty strong, but he could still easily have ace king and ace queen, right? He could also have pocket eights, stuff like this. So this is a scenario where you definitely want to call. You want to slow play this hand to death. If he checks the turn, I think you want to bet very small at that point. Notice you can bet 4,000 on the turn. Pot will go up to 20k. He'll have 16k behind, so you can shove the river. So that's what I would generally do in this spot.
It is very close for a reason that I do not see him continuing bluffing on the turn, because I do not have him as that kind of player type to be.
It's not that you're worried about him bluffing on the turn. It's more so that you want him to catch up on the turn if he has ace king or ace queen. And also, he's not just going to... He may or may not check fold ace king to a tiny turn bet. He may decide to check call one time, so you get money in from that hand that's drawing dead.
Barreling, like if I expect him to barrel off ace king on some runouts, like barreling queen and then shoving river, or barreling ace queen on king turn, then there's a lot of value. There's a tremendous big amount of value, large amount of value in calling. But I'm not sure that he's that player type. I expect him to shut down more often than not.
You also mentioned that you were worried about aces, kings, and queens not getting it in, I guess, by the river, but in order for that to happen, the board has to run out bad for aces, kings, and queens. So really, only an ace or a king are bad turns. All the other cards are still going to get those hands to put money in by the river. So I don't really think you need to worry about maximizing value from those hands. We're really just trying to figure out how do we get a little bit more money or a lot more money out of unpaired hands or bad pairs. And I think the only way to do that is to call. We're not really trying to get value out of aces, kings, and queens because we're going to get that value probably 90% of the time or more anyway.
So again, comes down to the flop decision. Once we the turn doesn't change anything, and see what happens. He continues betting. At this point, I think that he clearly has got pocket queens plus. So I think for the cases that he's got queens and kings and ace might fall off on the river, and that would prevent him from putting the rest of the stacks in, I should just jam, just shove the rest in. It's not like, relative to the pot size, I think it's a good shove. It's just 15k into 17, so yeah, it's not like overjam or anything.
So you mentioned here that, again, same concept as you're worried about this ace coming on the river. You actually should not have very many aces in your range. If your opponent's anywhere near good, he should realize that the only ace you can realistically have is ace-jack when you call again on the turn. So he shouldn't really fear the ace. Same thing goes for a king. You really shouldn't fear a king. This is assuming he has exactly pocket queens and an ace or a king comes. So I don't think that you are going to necessarily miss out on your value. You may, but even then, it's just not that often. I think you would much rather just call, because sometimes these guys are going to fold if you shove. They're going to show up with ace king or ace queen, believe it or not, and they're going to fold. And if this guy ever folds, it's a huge disaster. And did he actually fold this time? Yeah, well, he did. So given that he folded this time, it just kind of proves that this was a huge mistake jamming on this turn, because this guy had 0% equity, and you let a hand that has 0% equity fold in a spot where you're almost certainly going to stack the nut hands anyway. And I'm very confident you're going to stack the nut hands every time it doesn't come with an ace or a king. And even then, the odds of the ace or the king coming are so incredibly low. So I think this was a pretty big mistake. This is probably the biggest mistake I think we've seen so far. And I don't know if it's actually a gigantic equity blunder or anything, but I do think that there's a lot of merit in just keeping your range looking weak and allowing this guy to continue betting with whatever he has. Because again, we don't know what this guy's doing. He is playing tight, but that doesn't mean that he's just never ever bluffing, right? And he may not even view ace king as a bluff for all we know. He may think ace king is the best hand, so you just bet with ace king. That's how some players play.
And I shoved, and I think I remember this, and that he folded quite quickly. Yeah, so my read could have been wrong, and
be careful with reads in online poker, especially when you only have 100 hands on the guy or 89 hands on the guy. I just don't trust reads that much.
Both pre-flop and on the flop. So he could have decided to barrel, or maybe he had pocket tens and decided to bet for the turn. I'm not sure. Anyway, it's a very interesting spot. It's a very interesting hand, and I wonder whether I took it too far pre-flop, just flatting and being scared. I'm not scared. I just thought it would be a good line to take the pocket jacks here, and whether I just overstepped it and took it a step too far, not going to 3-bet call his hand.
I think the pre-flop call is perfectly fine. I'm not worried about that. I think that the main issue here is the turn play. I think 3-betting pre-flop or calling pre-flop are both fine. I'm a little bit surprised you are not very annoyed at yourself that this guy folded on the turn, because that just means that your whole thought process that this guy only has the nuts when he bets twice, that's wrong. And anytime you see someone fold like this, it should really challenge your whole thought process in this scenario, because it means whatever you were thinking in this spot and other very similar spots, which there should be a lot of similar spots to this, is often going to be incorrect. So that may lead you to make tighter folds on the turn than you should. Imagine you have queen jack suited here. You may consider folding the turn or something like that. Imagine you have pocket tens. Maybe you fold pocket tens, which I'm not going to say that's necessarily wrong, but it may not be wrong. And you always have to be challenging your assumptions, because the things that you think players do are not necessarily correct all the time. And sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. But given the fact that this guy folded here, this was a pretty big blunder. Not really a blunder, but, it didn't work out. It looks like it worked out. You won the pot. That's nice. But I think you maybe induced this guy to not give you 15,000 more.
Not sure. So, yeah, quite. Yeah, it's interesting to see other opinions.
I just don't buy it that every time the guy bets a flop and bets a turn, he must have the nuts. I guess that's all I'm trying to say.